you're not going to get rich backing them, but I touched earlier on, didn't I, Emily Upjohn, I think is as much of a certainty, I think, as you can get for the Oaks, which is probably the kiss of death for connections, but I think she will go very well. I touched upon as well Desert Crown for Sir Michael Stoute. And each way chance might be Piz Badil, each way at 8-1 for O'Brien, but not Aidan, Donica, his son. So that could be of interest for people. And I have to say, I was very impressed last night with the Brigadier Gerard Stakes winner, again for Sir Michael Stoute, a horse called Bay Bridge. And he was 16-1 before the race for the Prince of Wales Stakes at Ascot. He's now vying for favouritism at 3-1. So Sir Michael Stoute, past master, isn't he, at these horses, preparing them, giving them time. The horse was making its seasonal reappearance and it was unbeaten last year. That could be one for people to have a look out for.
Yeah, I watched that race and I'd agree with that. Very impressive. Came sort of down the outside and went away quite nicely. So you're absolutely right there. And thanks for those tips. Given my past experience over the last couple of months, I will ignore those at my peril, no doubt.
Well, I don't think you need to listen to my tips, given how well you're doing with your trainers. I noticed them myself that Michael Atwater and Neil Mulholland doing very well recently.
Yeah, they are. Yeah, both in good form.
Well, Phil, it's time to bring on our guest. You and I have spoken in previous months about going reports. Well, this month's guest is very well placed to comment on that subject, as he's the managing director of a company that works on technology solutions for going reports. Welcome, Mike Maher from Turftrax. Hi, Mike. Welcome to Inside the Rails.
Good morning. Thank you for inviting me on.
Well, thank you very much for joining us. Now, I touched upon there that Phil and I have talked a lot about going reports in recent episodes of Inside the Rails, and particularly the differences between the official descriptions and those reported back by jockeys. Now, your company, Turftrax, has a technology solution for evaluating the going on racecourses. Bit technical, but very important. Before we go into that, though, what's the Mike Maher story? How did you end up working in horse racing?
First of all, my family, my mother and father are from Ireland, and I don't think there are many people from Ireland who don't like a bit of a punt on the horses. So from a very early age, we were encouraged to have a bet, particularly on the Grand National, and that would be sort of, mid-80s. I remember my dad jumping around to the likes of Maori Venture winning the Grand National. Take it forward a bit, and my first visit to a racecourse was actually 1999. I live very close to Newmarket in Cambridge, and we took my mum there for a 50th birthday, and Frankie Dettori won on Island Sands. I did have to check that a bit earlier, but I remember Dettori winning. But my background was actually in agriculture for 7 or 8 years. My background in agriculture brought me to ASE Solutech. That company became Turftrax, and 18 months after I watched my first live horse race at the July course, I was driving along the July course on a quad bike, collecting what we call electromagnetic induction data, basically telling us what parts of the racecourse are likely to be softer, or what part of the racecourse is likely to be firmer. So not a traditional way of getting into racing, but that's my story.
Okay, and when was Turftrax actually established, and how has it developed?
It was established about a year or so before I joined the company. So it was established in the late 90s by, first of all, carrying out that initial soil survey that I helped to carry out at Newmarket. The first course to use it courses were Haydock Park and Aintree, and the first ever what we call going maps were produced in the late 90s, and then early I joined very early in 2001, and at the time there were only 2 full-time employees at the company. When I joined, that increased to 4.
Okay, that's interesting. Now, obviously you've got a technical background, but for our listeners, many of whom are sort of laymen when it comes to the going stick, can you describe what it is and how it works and the output that it generates?
Yeah, it's an electromechanical device. So at the top end, there's a handle and a box that records all the data. and you plug the charger in there to charge it up, and you plug a download in there to download the data when you return to your laptop or PC. At the bottom end, at the base, there was what we call the probe, and attached to the probe are two tiny little things called strain gauges, and they're extremely sensitive, and they read the resistance as the probe is pushed into the ground and pulled back. It's a 100 millimeter probe, standard size. They're all the same size, and they all get checked and calibrated every year. And as those are pushed in a gradual but firm motion, the device, the probe, and as it's pushed in, it reads something called penetration, and think of the hoof. And then as it's pulled back, the probe moves through the soil profile and the root structure and measures what we call shear. They are then combined in a sort of unique algorithm and formula that we developed over a number of years to produce the index reading that you see. You see a published average index reading made up of a minimum of 30 penetrations, 30 shears, into the ground. And each of those locations is made up of 3 measurements of each of those types.
And again, for the benefit of our listeners, in terms of the actual readings, which way round is it? Is it the lower the number? Is it softer or faster ground? Just in layman's terms, just which way round is it?
Yeah, the lower numbers on our device, the Turftrax going stick, mean softer ground, and higher numbers mean firmer ground. The scale goes from 1.0 up to 15.0. The reality is that you're not going to push the thing into a puddle, because the race meeting, if there's a load of puddles on the course, the race meeting would be off. And equally, you're not going to push the thing into concrete. So if I stood and tried to push the probe into concrete, it would read 15, but it wouldn't be a valid measurement anyway, because the probe hasn't gone in the ground. So most of the readings fall. If you go out on a given day, if the ground was very soft, you might get some readings as low as 2.5. And if it was very firm, and I know we're going to possibly come on to worldwide, but I'm talking about the UK now. If the ground was very firm, you might get a reading of maybe 10.5 or 11. But remember, those are individual readings, and every course has variability to some degree. So most of the published average readings that people see tend to fall somewhere between about 4.5 up to something like 9.5, maybe 10.
That's lovely. You've explained that very well. Thank you. Now, look, I know that you go to a lot of the big UK race meetings. Which tracks do you go to, and what's your role there when you do go?
So every course uses the device under the British Horse Racing Authority rules of racing. So they have to have a device available and use it for declaration stage and on the day of the race. For the major race meetings, I started testing the device at the major race meetings back in 2002, 2003. So it's the 20th year, would you believe? When I was walking the course at Newmarket recently, 20th year of doing Guineas readings. But the meetings that I help out at, and I'm going to go sort of, through the calendar year, the Cheltenham Festival, the Grand National, the Guineas at Newmarket. I will be at Epsom next week. Sandown in between. I forget, some of them. Where else do I go? Goodwood for Glorious Goodwood. And then I chip in other Ascot race meetings, Newmarket race meetings later on in the year, and odd visits. But most of those classic type race meetings or big festival type race meetings, to come on to the next part of the question. Well, why am I there? Well, look, they're huge events, and some of them have 5,000-6,000 staff there. So there is. me being there is for two reasons. One thing, it enables the person who usually takes the stick readings, might be the clerk of the course, might be an estates manager or head groundsman, to be able to focus on other things. And what it also does is mean that I and Turftrax and the device are testing that ground independently and then feeding that information back to the clerk of the course with some knowledge and advice where needed over. And that's not me telling them what to do. That's me looking at analysing data and then discussing with them and looking at things like weather patterns and forecasts and just, trying to help them make that decision about, are we watering, what should the ground be called? So that independent nature of assessing the ground for those major race meetings.
Sounds to me like a dream job for somebody that enjoys a day at the races. You're getting to go to all the big ones, Mike. And I know when we met at the HWPA Awards last year that the Going Stick's also taking you overseas as well, because you were telling me all about that. Can you share with the listeners some of the other big races you've attended internationally?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. And actually, your first point there, Phil, earlier on, I explained that my introduction to the sport was watching the Grand National. When I tell people what I do, first of all, most of them can't believe such a job exists, and then they all say, "Do you need anyone to help you out?" and to watch those great races on TV, and then to be walking around, walking up to Beecher's Brook or the Chair or the winning post at Cheltenham or Swinley Bottom, at Ascot. It is a fantastic, it's a challenging job, and there's many different things I do, and quite boring parts of the job sometimes. But when you're walking around a racecourse and the sun is shining and it's the morning of a major race meeting and that atmosphere is building up, I do feel very privileged to be doing the job I do. Overseas, the device is now being used. If we start in Europe, the major French racecourses have started using it in the last couple of years. So Longchamp, Saint-Cloud, or Toy, they're using it there. Germany have adopted it as well in the last 2 years. Over in the US, there's about 12 of the major tracks there using it. So places like Santa Anita. Then we go to Saudi, Australia, and New Zealand's our next biggest market, Hong Kong. So the other day, I was flying over to Ireland to do some testing out there at a location that at the moment just would like to test and hoping to go live later on in the year. But I was on an early morning flight and it was a long day, and I knew I was doing this podcast. So I thought, just try and count up how many race courses you've been to. So the UK is pretty easy because I've been to sort of 57. There's 2 I haven't visited, Fosslas and Bath. I've been to somewhere around 110 race courses around the world, and they include, Santa Anita, as I already said, the major tracks in France, Ranwick, Flemington, Chartin, Happy Valley, just some absolutely fantastic, tracks and locations to visit and places to visit. I've been to the Melbourne Cup about 10 times to do a similar role out there to what I do here that led to the Going Stick being adopted by the major tracks in Victoria. And the Melbourne Cup as an event is up there with any of our big race meetings here, and I would highly recommend anyone who's into horse racing to attend that event.
Your bag carrier does sound quite appealing. I'm not surprised you've got a queue of people wanting to do that. But on a sideline, I've been to both Fosslas and Bath, so I'm 2 up on you there, even if you're hundreds up elsewhere.
There you go, Phil.
Does the Going Stick indicate big differences in the ground we race on in the UK compared to other countries? And do people use the readings differently in other jurisdictions?
Yeah, so we've now got 20 years of data, as I said, in the UK. We've got 10 years of data on some of the Australian tracks. It's quite clear that ground that we would describe as good, and I'm with putting some big inverted commas around that good as I speak with my hands here, is not what would be